Hello again. In this video, I'll be covering a few topics. Why I moved to Linux in the first place, why I moved away from Ubuntu and started using openSUSE Tumbleweed, and why I moved from GNOME to KDE. But first, I think I'll be covering why I won't be updating to Windows 11 and why I think I finally will be uninstalling Windows 10 and going completely onto Linux. So let's start with the Windows 11. A little bit of story time. Let me just set the stage. A few months back, I wanted to gift my brother a new laptop. Nothing fancy. A entry level laptop with 16 GB RAM, 1 terabyte of storage. The good old days when you could actually get those 6 months back, that is. He had an older laptop which also ran Windows 10 and Ubuntu on dual boot. So with the new laptop, I was planning to do the same, but install openSUSE Tumbleweed as dual boot with Windows 11. So you have to be aware this is a brand new laptop bought from the store, straight out of the box. A user ID hasn't been created and so on. So on the first boot, I tried the offline installation. I knew that Windows 11 asks you for your details like email ID to get the operating system started. So I did a little research, went with the offline approach, and was able to boot it for the first time, was able to log in. But then I had to provide an email ID to get things like Microsoft Office to work or Microsoft 365 Copilot. I don't know what's called now. Nonetheless, I needed to use the email ID, so I created a new one because I did not have an Outlook account and I was planning on sharing the password with my brother so that he can use it, change the password later. Now, to create a brand new email ID seemed to be such a big pain because after creating it, while it allowed me to open Microsoft Office and use it, it still told me that it hasn't been registered yet because apparently the email ID I created on Outlook.com was shady. They said that there was suspicious activity, I guess, in the few minutes that I created it. I have to reiterate, it's a brand new laptop with a brand new email ID, so I don't know what is suspicious about that. Now that's I think where the trouble start because it did not strike me that I was supposed to get that fixed by actually providing a phone number. So that's a clever tactic of theirs to say that it's suspicious activity and then take your phone number in order to validate a brand new email ID with a brand new laptop. So I didn't know that. I went ahead with the dual boot installation by first of all removing BitLocker encryption and then resize the partition. Now because of NVIDIA graphics card and Linux installations, I usually disable secure boot, and once I did that, all hell broke loose. The account was tied to the email ID for login as well, and it just refused to log me in, just like how a corporate account would. So if you work in a company and the company provides you a laptop, there's a central administration that governs all these machines, meaning they can lock down certain machines if they think it's stolen or if they think it's been hacked or whatever the case is. There is another person who can control your laptop remotely. And on this brand new laptop with a brand new account, getting locked out, I was freaking incensed. I thought I forgot my password. I tried that password, tried variations of it, it just wouldn't unlock. And then finally, I realized I had to unlock the account by actually providing a phone number so that they could remove that suspicious status and then log me in. That was the moment when I decided not to update to Windows 11. This was around the time that the Windows 10 security updates were being phased out, and Microsoft was pushing people to install Windows 11. I was still on Windows 10 for other reasons. I just did not like the Windows 11 user experience. I would see how long I could run Windows 10 before it actually became an issue and uninstall it. On a side note, I was using Windows 10 a little bit for work because of Microsoft Office. That is one application that doesn't have the same user experience on Linux. I did not want to try out options on Wine and so on because again, I don't know when it would break. So for work, when I took up a project, I had the home version installed, but I logged in using the new ID that I was provided by my employer. It automatically converted to the premium version, and once the project was done and the email ID was disabled, I had to log out of it. And when I logged out, I realized I lost access to even the home version of it. I don't think they have a product key like they used to. I think with the newer versions of even Microsoft Office Home and Student Edition, I think you need an email ID to register it. I did not want to give my email ID to get that registered. I thought it's working fine, just leave it as is. But I did not realize when I put in the official email ID that I would be losing the other one. So now, since I've lost access to even the home and student edition where everything is just read only, while the piracy route is an enticing option, I think it's time for me to just stop using Windows 10. I do not game, so the only reason for me using Windows 10 all these years was for Microsoft Office and the other was for HP printers. Now, since I don't have an HP printer anymore as well, I think I've run out of excuses to keep it on. So the next time I have some time and patience, I think I'll be wiping down the entire drive and go purely on to openSUSE Tumbleweed. So that was the story of why I did not want to update to Windows 11, but I think more importantly, I think that was the point I decided I'm not going to use Windows anymore. So talking about why I like Linux, Tumbleweed, and KDE, I think I'll just stick to about three broad points and then talk a little bit more about them individually. So let's start off with Tumbleweed. It is a rolling release distribution, which means you get the latest versions of applications and systems files. You get it relatively quicker compared to other distributions. So if you get the latest packages and system files, there is a chance that there may be issues with them, causing system breakages, but that's where I think the openSUSE team shines. They have a good QA process, so there are relatively fewer issues in their snapshots. There have been issues in the past. For example, the Mesa driver had broken, causing screen tearing. So basically, you would get garbled images on the screen. That issue took a day or two to get fixed. For me, that was a minor speed bump, but I think some people actually got affected by it. So having learned from that, I have two separate Tumbleweed installations, one for home use and the other for work. So I usually test out any updates on the home system and see if anything breaks before I actually update the work system. Now I understand that most people wouldn't have a setup like this, but that's something worth considering when you switch over to Tumbleweed. That being said, because you get the latest applications and systems files, folks with newer hardware might benefit from it because taking my own example, I had an Asus laptop where, initially the keyboard backlight and so on did not work. They relied on the generosity of people like Luke Nukem, who created the necessary drivers for it to work, and we had to install it separately. Later, it got merged into the kernel, but since I was using Ubuntu, it would take time to actually get it. And when I tried to manually install the kernel, after a few iterations, it broke the install itself. So in a rolling release, they test out these packages and push these latest kernel updates over to you, making you fully utilize whatever hardware you have. Another advantage I see the rolling release having, every time you run an update, technically it is updating the distribution. So unlike Ubuntu, where I prefer, again due to my own paranoia, I guess, to do a clean install every 6 months whenever a new release is out there, with Tumbleweed, I don't have to do that. A simple update updates all the packages. That's the beauty of rolling release. So to sum up, the advantages are basically you get continuous updates of the latest applications and systems files. But on the downside, there are chances that it might break. So if you're using it for work, I would recommend using openSUSE Leap. or else you may have to maintain two different installations and update your work laptop only after you test it out on a separate system. On a side note, even the stable operating systems can also have bugs and can have critical failures. However, the chances of things breaking in a stable release is much more rare compared to a rolling release. Once you get things set up on Tumbleweed, I'm using KDE. Once you get these things set up, everything is quite breezy and simple, as pun intended. The KDE theme is breeze. Whether you pick GNOME, KDE, or XFC, or any other variant, I think the user experience is much better than on Windows and on Mac OS. The two major desktop environments are GNOME and KDE. GNOME is oriented for probably mobile users because they have very simple and clean design, whereas KDE is highly customizable. The look and feel is towards the older Windows systems. In KDE, almost every element can be customized, making it a very powerful tool, but also it might be quite overwhelming. The amount of customization opportunities in KDE, it's both an advantage and a disadvantage. We can all agree that choice is good. However, too much choice is a little overwhelming. If you're looking at theming, widgets, and so on, KDE is a good choice. If you want simplicity with aesthetic, then GNOME is the way to go. If you want a bare bones, quick, simple desktop environment, you can choose XFCE. One of the main things that you interact with in an operating system is the file manager. I personally use Thunar, even though I have KDE, which has Dolphin as a file manager. It's a very powerful and very feature-rich file manager. However, I like the simplicity of Thunar and it has a very powerful renamer tool. It saves me a lot of time if I have to rename files and so on. With the choices that it provides, none of the other file managers have that option while also being quite easy to use. So when you use Tumbleweed or just Linux based distributions in general, the user experience is usually quicker, smoother, less flashy compared to Windows or Mac OS. But the key thing is that it gets the job done effectively. Now, if you remove the rose tinted glasses, yes, there are some issues. For example, when I spoke about hardware, while we do get the latest updates and so on in Tumbleweed, for Linux in general, some hardware they still don't utilize their full potential. An example is NVIDIA graphics cards. In a very short span of time, I think in the last year or two, I think mostly because of the AI push, we're seeing a lot of updates there. There are far fewer issues now compared to what it was before. However, there may be issues like fingerprint sensor not working on a laptop and so on because the vendor hasn't made the code open source or hasn't shared that with the kernel development team and so on. Another minor issue is printer setup on Tumbleweed. It's easier now, but initially it was more cumbersome than what it should have been. The next issue is applications and the packaging system. As I covered in the previous video, I covered all the different types of packaging systems that we can use in openSUSE Tumbleweed. If you had asked me a few years back which operating system had the best package management system or software management system, I would have said Linux or Ubuntu hands down. I used to use Synaptic, which was an easy option to quickly browse for applications and install them, as opposed to Windows having I think the Microsoft Store, going to individual software sites, downloading it, installing it. You would have exe files, MSI files, and so on. And in case there's any dependency, you would have to install a separate package and so on from another site. And then you would have to manage the updates either from the Microsoft Store or from the individual apps. Whereas in Ubuntu, you can manage it either from the command line interface or from Synaptic in the case of Ubuntu, where it was a one-stop shop. But now with the introduction of Flatpaks, AppImages, snaps, and so on, there are different ways of installing an application, and each type has a different method to install an application and update it. So it's not the best method right now. Flatpaks, AppImages, and Snaps, however, are distribution agnostic, so that's one good thing. You can install it on any distribution. However, it depends on the developer as to which packaging system they would use. Personally, I would prefer if everybody just built it for the operating system itself. However, that's not the case. Developers usually prefer Debian packages over RPM packages, and the newer applications usually come out either in Flatpak, AppImages, and sometimes on Snap. It is something we have to live with, but I'm happy that we still have access to a wide range of really good quality applications out there. Talking about applications, while there are apps on Windows and Mac OS like Adobe Photoshop, MS Office, you don't have an apples to apples version of it on Linux. You can run it on things like Wine and so on, but again, it depends on the version that you have, the chances that it might break, and so on and so forth. Many Linux users will recommend alternatives like GIMP for Photoshop and LibreOffice for MS Office. However, those do not have the same kind of features, polish, or user experience. While it can get most basic actions done using Linux applications, sometimes the best software is the one available on Mac OS or on Windows. That's something you need to be mindful of before you decide to switch over to Linux or Tumbleweed. And finally, as a small note, battery life is not the best. With newer laptops and so on, I think it's better than what it was before, but it's still, I don't think it compares to Windows or Mac OS. And finally, the most important reason why I like Linux distributions, not just Tumbleweed in particular, is the privacy and security. As I mentioned in the story in the beginning of this video, in over 20 years of using a personal computer, I've never been locked out because of suspicious activity. I recently saw a Gamer Nexus and Level 1 Tech video where they were talking about Windows users losing access to their accounts and not being able to get it back because of Microsoft's security policies. I could relate to it to a certain extent based on that one incident. Another coercion tactic that they generally use is while saving files. I generally use the shortcut F12 to save files. It usually directs me to the documents folder. However, overnight when OneDrive got installed, it would automatically prompt you to save it on the cloud storage instead of your local drive. So I have to clarify that the worst bug that I may have seen on Linux pales in comparison to these tactics used in Microsoft and Windows operating system in particular. I have always been wary of them. I don't save any personal or important files on Windows systems. Rather, I save it on my Linux installation. The main reason why I switched over to Linux a long time back was because an antivirus was not required. In fact, the antivirus that's available on Linux called ClamAV is mostly used to scan files before we send it to Windows users so that you don't inadvertently send a virus over to them. The security is managed by SE Linux on Tumbleweed. That's the default now. Maybe a year or so ago, it used to be AppArmor. That's, I think, still available on Ubuntu, but that generally manages security at a system level rather than acting as an antivirus, so to speak. I don't know if any other commentator has brought this up, but if you notice when you search YouTube for videos of what to do after a Windows installation or what to do when you get a brand new laptop, most of the videos about Windows is what you need to turn off, what you need to remove. But when you check any Linux video of what to do after an installation, it's mostly what to add, what to turn on. The privacy settings in KDE as well, if you leave them on, such as sharing details or indexing, which is basically indexing all the files for the search feature, and it just takes maybe a click or two to shut it off completely. The privacy portion of it, where it shares details with the KDE team, It basically mentions which version of operating system, whether you're using Wayland or not. Those kind of things get shared without sending any user details and so on. So when we compare the privacy and security settings, I think between Windows and Linux, I feel Linux is way better. Having said all that, there are some security issues in Linux which crop up from time to time. However, when there are security issues, the community rallies, try to come up with a fix really quickly and communicate it to the community at large with full transparency. This was a mini rant. I don't think I'll be making videos shitting on Windows. I would rather focus on the positive experiences than the negative ones. I understand that for some people, using Windows may be the only option for either home or work use. The main reasons why I wanted to switch from Ubuntu, I've covered one of the points, which was I did not want to have a fresh install every 6 months every time there was a major update that was there. I wanted something that would keep constantly updating without me having to do a fresh install. But the main reason for moving over to a different distribution was GNOME. I've been using Ubuntu since I think the Unity desktop environment days. I loved the feature where you could search for actions within an application. So if you're using LibreOffice Calc, instead of clicking on the toolbar and searching for something like pivot table, you could actually just use a shortcut, type it in, and it would automatically give you all the options with the word pivot in it, for example. When Ubuntu moved over to GNOME, it took a little bit of time to adjust, I think, not too much. But as the years went by and as different versions of GNOME started coming out, the design and the workflow or the way you interact with the desktop environment started changing, and the configuration as well became too rigid where you could not modify certain themes, certain settings, and so on. Again, the minor annoyances started adding up. The final straw was when I could not open Thunderbird in full screen every time I opened it. So if I opened Thunderbird, I had to always go and maximize it. That was probably due to OCD, but it started becoming a major annoyance after some time. I moved over to Tumbleweed, but unfortunately, I think because of the NVIDIA drivers at that point of time, I got like a black screen whenever I tried to log in, so you would not reach the login screen. That was a big turn off, so I moved back to Ubuntu, tried Fedora. Fedora worked really well, but one of my key requirements is I wanted something similar to the Synaptic application where I could have a very clean, easy to use package manager, which Fedora didn't have. There is an application called Dragora DNF in Fedora. Most of the time it did not work or just crashed. So back I went to Ubuntu. Then I thought, okay, let me try KDE on Ubuntu. I think that was obviously the most rational way to approach things rather than just changing the distribution. I tried Kubuntu flavor. That didn't work. Again, because I think the NVIDIA drivers caused that black screen error. So I just went back to Ubuntu and GNOME and used that for a while. It was, I think, a year or two ago when KDE Plasma 6 was going to be released. Around that time, even the NVIDIA drivers, I think, was gaining some traction. That's when I remembered openSUSE Tumbleweed. I really loved the YAST application, which was comparable with Synaptic, but there were other components to it where you could also update system settings. So that was a huge selling point for Tumbleweed at that point, and that's what made me go back to Tumbleweed rather than trying Fedora again. This time round, the installation went well. There was no black screen error. Used it for a week or so, a little more than that. Things were working fine. That's when I just decided to stick on with Tumbleweed. While Yast is no longer there, that's one of the primary reasons for me to use Tumbleweed initially. They have replaced it now with Merlin and Cockpit. I will be making videos on Cockpit later on. I've already covered Merlin in the previous videos that I have, so do check them out. But those are, I think, some of the value adds that Tumbleweed provides the general Linux user. Windows users who are confused as to which distribution to use. I'm not a gamer. This is not specified towards gaming. So if you are looking at probably gaming, you may look at other distributions, I think. I'm not too sure about Tumbleweed being the best option there. Again, I'm not an expert on this. I would not be able to comment on it. You'll have to do a little bit of research before you pick. However, if you are a general user, Tumbleweed is a great option. If you are looking at moving from Windows over to Linux, or if you are a current Linux user on a different distribution looking at a rolling release, you can check out the videos that I've made on how to install the operating system, some of the basic actions to take after you install it, and so on. I'm hoping this video basically gives you enough information to make a more informed decision of you moving over to Linux or over to Tumbleweed. Again, this is not a video to just shit on Windows. Some people require Windows for whatever reason. If they have a specific software that only works on Windows, or if their work environment requires that. This is not a video to convince you to move over. This is just a video sharing my experiences, and hopefully you learn something from it. If you do like this video and if you'd like to support this channel, please head over to my Patreon and consider becoming a patron. I offer a cherry tree notebook file with detailed instructions of the tutorials that I've posted, and also some common commands that are used in Linux, so that you have all this information in an easy to access place. The notebook as well serves as a living document for you to use, where you can add your personal updates over there. If you're still listening to this video, thank you, and I hope you have a good one. See you in the next video.